بعد هالحوار الشيق بننتقل إلى المايندز تشابتر مع حلقة حوارية تحت عنوان حال العالم والنماذج الناشئة للقيادة بعصر ما بعد العولمة. ومندعي إلى المنصة كل من الدكتور فريدريك شاريون, University Professor, founder of the IRSEM, French Ministry of Defense France, و His Excellency Alberto Fernandez, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, وأيضا His Excellency Marwan Mouachar, former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan, Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His Excellency Alec Shelbrooke, member of the UK Parliament and UK Conservative Party also, please. طبعا وبدير جلسة الحوار الدكتور سامي نادر, Director of Levent Institute for Strategic Affairs من لبنان.
بداية لابد من شكر مؤسسة معيش ضياف. بداية لابد يعني من كلمة شكر لمؤسسة معيش ضياف لهذا الحدث الاستثنائي connecting minds, انه تحدي اساسي انه تبقى الادمغه تبني جسور بين بعضنا وما نتحول في مرحلة ما إلى دماغ واحد وعقل واحد وفكر واحد. فهنيئا بهالرسالة ونحن وراك بهالمشروع. Let me start with the first on my left. The Member of Parliament, His Excellency Alec Shelbrooke, is member of the UK. So my first question is, we all know that the Brexit was a challenge not only for Europe, but for the international system. And the idea is, my question to you, do you see that the Brexit can pave the way for a new model of leadership, in a new international system that would be more in favor of peace and facing up to the challenges that we are going through nowadays?
Well, first of all, let me say how delighted I am to be in Lebanon. Your country's been exceptionally welcoming to me, and it's a real pleasure to be here, my first time in the Middle East, so it's fantastic to be here. Brexit is a highly complicated set of reasons as to why people voted in the way they did. Prime Minister Theresa May has made it clear that her government is not just about delivering Brexit, but also tackling the reasons behind why people voted for Brexit. And on the whole, they weren't really due to an ideology about the European Union. The numbers of people who actually swung the vote one way or the other were voting on issues of immigration, of reduction in depression of wages, job opportunities, house prices, and it very much came down to the view in terms of the British public that the global economy, the liberal centre, wasn't working for them. And they had somebody to blame in the European Union, and they took that blame out on the European Union and said, well, we want to separate from that. In terms of where this leaves the global situation in terms of
the impact on foreign policy.
Yeah, on foreign policy.
On the Middle East in particular.
Yeah, on welfare of the world. It's more nuanced in the sense of you're seeing Britain, for example, break away from the body of the European Union, but at the same time stay engaged on the world stage in terms of its commitments with NATO and, of course, its seat at the UN Security Council. I think that Britain is still very clear in its policy of the two-state solution in Israel, and is very clear on its support that there has to be a Palestinian homeland as well. And in many ways, Britain is slightly different in terms of the European Union because we always did hold a slightly separate position from the EU body as a whole in terms of its position in international affairs. And that is in many ways being strengthened now as Britain looks towards the fact that you cannot make the mistakes of Iraq again, as we've heard about earlier on. It is absolutely vital that countries such as Lebanon is stable, secure. Obviously, the situation has changed in the last few days, and Britain must make sure that it does everything it can to support the country. But of course, that also ties very strongly into, it's not so much linked to Brexit or the European Union, but it is tied into our strong international development policy and ensuring that the levels of aid that come to Lebanon to support the refugees coming out of Syria is absolutely vital. And in terms of the Syria platform, we still must be trying every means we can to bring a peace and stability to Syria, because ultimately the refugee crisis engulfing Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, in terms of Syrian movement, will only be solved when people have a safe place to go back to in Syria.
Let me take it to Mr. Frédéric Charillon, who is professor at Sciences Po. Mr. Charillon, I mean, my question will turn around this idea of nation state, because we're in an international system where the nation state is still the building block of the system. However, this nation state is under threat. It's challenged economically, it's challenged by the rise of ideologies and the rise of religions. What's your take on that?
Yes, you're right. We are in a kind of it's very paradoxical, because we cannot say. Some years ago, I remember the big fashion in international relations, international studies, was to say that the nation state was over, that it would disappear. It's not the case, but now there is a big struggle between the resistance of the state, in a way, and also attacks against the state with new models. What are those new models? From below, I would say, you have new leaders, since the topic of our meeting is also new kinds of leadership. You are witnessing new kinds of leadership, religious leadership, improvised, most of them. If you think about al-Baghdadi or most of them are improvised. Grassroots level leaderships, but also the resurgence of all old kinds of maybe imperial leaderships beyond the nation states.
But what you make of the rise of populism of the Catalan case today? Isn't it a challenge for the national state model of Spain?
I think it's not a challenge against, it's not a will against the nation state, it's a crisis of legitimacy. I think there is, and that's why the leadership, kinds of leaderships are required. There is a crisis of legitimacy in politics. People want to turn the page of old models of authority because they don't think it's legitimate anymore. This is striking in this world. In the West, in the non-Western world, recently you had many examples many cases where people wanted to turn a page. It can take several shapes. It can take the shape of Donald Trump in the US, because after all, it was also a kind of challenge against the traditional political game. Of course, you have the example of France, when a very young guy, almost unknown a few months before, won the presidential election. Unfortunately, he can also take other kinds of manifestations, of expressions, more violent. But it's a problem of legitimacy. The state itself is not in crisis, but the way the state manages the situation, which are not acceptable anymore by the situation, by the populations, is probably the big problem now.
Let me take it now to Mr. Marwan Machar, His Excellency Mr. Marwan Machar, former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan and currently Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's the same idea, Your Excellency, about the nation state, but in the Levant. It's still surviving in Europe. However, in the Levant, if we look at Syria, the state is practically collapsing. In Lebanon, it's the least to say that the state is in crisis. And similarly in Iraq, it's not well entrenched yet, and it seems that the legacy of Sykes-Picot is this nation-state idea is totally under threat. What's your take on that?
I think the main reason why nation states, if you can call them nation states in the Levant, are under threat was because they were never complete nation states in the first place. Nation states are based on institutions, are based on democratic norms, are based on a sense of citizenship, that all people are citizens regardless of their ethnic origin or religion. Or we did not have that model in the Middle East. And therefore, when people went to the street to object against oppression, they did not find, the state did not find the institutions or the people to defend it. And people went against each other, and institutions crumbled almost overnight in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, even in Iraq at times. So yes, it is true that today the nation state in the Levant is under huge threat from what I call non-state actors. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militias in Iraq, Daesh in Syria and Iraq. These are all non-state actors, people that are below the state, that are threatening the nation state. But the solution to developing healthy nation states in the Levant, which is not a solution that unfortunately anyone, probably with the exception of Tunisia, is undertaking, the solution is to build serious and credible and strong institutions. These are the pillars that will make nation states in the Levant credible and sustainable. And you cannot do that without developing a different sense of citizenship in the region, where a citizen, has equal rights, whether they are men or women, whether they are Muslim or Christian, whether they are liberal or conservative, whether they are secular or Islamist. If we are not able to do that through social contracts that redefine the meaning of nation states in the Levant, I'm sure, I'm afraid the worst is yet to come.
So you're saying it will be replaced by a different political model based on citizenship?
We need that. Otherwise, there will be more chaos and more unstable societies and more wars in the Middle East.
Is this a solution for the post-Daesh era? Is the ideology that brought Daesh or the other forces that are challenging Daesh, but based on religious idea, is this dynamic over, and is this project of citizenship right enough?
The dynamic of Daesh will only be over if you replace it with something credible, with a credible alternative. But if the solution is to defeat Daesh militarily, Daesh has already been defeated. Before the end of the year, Daesh will be out militarily. Will they be out as an ideology? I don't think so. We have experienced the same phenomenon in Iraq in 2007, 2008, when Zarqawi was also defeated militarily, and then a more radical, more barbaric form emerged through Daesh. We, countries of the region, societies of the region, have to understand that the way forward is through building institutions and not through a security prism alone. That is not going to solve the problems of the region.
So let me take it to Mr. Alberto Fernandez, the president of the Middle East Broadcasting Network. I mean, Mr. Fernandez, your comment on what Mr. Mashar said about the way ahead and
well, I agree. I think the problem is you have two very fraught and difficult models that are the predominant ones in the region. You have the model of authoritarian regimes, which are not really states. They're parties or armies that control governments or national intelligence entities that control governments. So you have the discourse of regimes, of kind of exhausted, discredited regimes whose authority is being challenged as never before. And then all too often in the region, the default alternative is an authoritarian discourse to be frank, of Islamists, from Wilayat al-Faqih to Salafi jihadism. So those are very limiting, if not dangerous and terrible models for human flourishing, for building societies, for building a more stable region. I think my concern is that the Daesh is going away, but the building blocks of the ideology are all intact. And it still is going to have a certain attraction given the bankruptcy, the moral, political, and to be frank, socioeconomic bankruptcy of regimes in the region. That other thing, whatever that alternative is, if it's jihadism or anything else, whatever that ideology is going to have a certain attraction when regimes in the region are so disastrously run. There's some small good elements happening. I don't want to overpraise them. There are regimes in the region that are trying to reform themselves. And again, all of the examples of regimes trying to reform themselves have negative parts to it. But if you look at Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or even less successful efforts at reform, say in Jordan or in Egypt, they are trying to. They may do it badly, they may fail completely, but they're realizing that what we have now doesn't really work. And then you have a whole other range of governments and countries where they haven't even reached the point of even thinking or planning about reform. They are paralyzed, they are frozen in this kind of dead end political model, which is only going to lead to a bad result. I mean, if you look at the socioeconomic indicators of the region, your hair should stand on end. And we focus all too often today of the bombs that have gone off, right? We talk about Syria, we talk about Iraq, we talk about Libya, we talk about Yemen. The whole region is a region of economic disaster, incredible variance between the rich and the poor, tremendous poverty, tremendously badly run countries and badly run economics. So there's a huge challenge ahead.
I want your view on U.S. role in this fight against Daesh. You said that Daesh, that is not over, that ideology is still here. So what's your view on the American role today? Is the military means enough? Building walls and is the right policy to contain this kind of threat?
Daesh is being defeated principally, obviously, with a lot of help of a lot of brave forces in Iraq and in other places, and backed up by tremendous American military power. But the challenge of defeating the ideology is not an American challenge. It has to come from the region. And the problem is the region is in a deep crisis of authority. All levels of authority, political authority, religious authority, social authority, under are under assault as never before. So people are looking for some kind of alternative, and the alternatives, the principal default alternatives, are not very good. You know, to go from an authoritarian regime run by the military to the Ikhwan or to some type of jihadism is from bad to worse. So you need something else that is not so, well-formed and plausible for people.
Mr. Brook, what could be this something else that we need? Democracy is obviously challenged by the rise of populism. And I want to gear this discussion towards what are today the triumphing values. Because if we're talking about an international system, that we at one point we have to say what are these values that are that should be underlying this new system, but because it seems that the values of democracy are not in the mood anymore.
I think the latter part of that statement is true in developed democracies where people have become complacent about the freedoms they have. I think when you fundamentally get down to the human spirit, it comes down to a simple thing. It's people want the freedom to live their lives, worship, do everything they want in their lives in the way that they want to. And it comes down to people wanting to be able to provide a stable and supportive lifestyle for them and their families. When we look across the Middle East with some areas of hugely concentrated wealth, quite often that doesn't work its way down to a majority of the population in many areas. Now, the idea that you can bring in democratic reforms across wide areas of the Middle East is naive in the sense that to do that, those in control, those in power, will be A, giving up their power, and B, probably giving up a lot of their wealth. And in many ways, it's if they want to stay in power, they want to carry on running their countries, they have to work out a mechanism where people's standard of living will expand and grow, that they have a freedom to worship in a way that they want to, and that the day-to-day decisions that affect their lives that they may have some influence over. Now, these are big steps and small steps. The idea, for example, that if we take Saudi Arabia as an example, that the Kingdom of Saud will give up its power and have elections and move down, that's simply not realistic. That's not going to happen. But the idea in reforms that may be able to be made that will see a better distribution of the wealth down to people and their standard of living, and the fact that in sort of local elections where there has been some reforms, allow people to take more of a stake in their communities is probably a sensible way forward. If you look at the situation in the West, when you talk about the deficit of democracy in many ways in the West and the rise of populism and where that's coming from, it's based around the fact that A, people don't ever see a threat to their democracy because it's been established for such a long time. And equally it comes down to, but this wonderful democracy isn't delivering for me. But all of that is relative. So if you take the United Kingdom as one of the fifth richest, or the fifth richest country in the world in terms of GDP, there are many people who claim about abject poverty in Britain, but it's all relative. And the fact that they have housing, they have food, they have energy.
They worry about their economic rights first.
They worry about their economic rights, and this comes back to my original point about what people were voting on in Brexit. What happened in the United Kingdom was that when the East European countries came into the European Union, you had a highly skilled workforce being able to move freely to countries like Britain, but willing to do the job for the minimum wage. So whereas the skilled workforce in Britain were probably earning 5 times minimum wage, suddenly people are willing to do it for minimum wage because that's 5 times their minimum wage in their country. And that's then led to people voting for a situation where they want to shut that down. Now, they had that opportunity in Britain through the European Union. If you look at the election in the United States, what Donald Trump said very successfully was that the liberal economic policies of the last 20 or 30 years haven't worked for you, the blue-collar working class person. If you take mining in the coal industry, etc., if you take the manual labour jobs in states like Pennsylvania, it was no shock that Trump was able to win Pennsylvania because he appealed directly to those people who they felt had been left behind in the liberal economic agenda. So whereas you had government after government saying, actually, it's a good thing for the United States that jobs have gone out to Mexico because it's allowed us to increase our GDP, if you're the person who worked in those jobs in the Rust Belt states, that doesn't look too good to you because you're not earning out of this. And that model of making sure that the people who scratch out their living, do manual labour, work class, seeing their life improve is not necessarily a model which is related directly to democracy, but it's a model related to the human condition. And all countries, whatever their form of governance, should be taking heed of that lesson.
In the same line of thought, Mr. Charion, are the ideals of democracy over, and now with the rise of the individual, citizens are worrying about their economic rights, and this is explain the rise of populism, slogans like "We will make America great again," but it's about self-centered principles and slogans.
No, the idea of democracy is certainly not over, but it probably needs to be rethought and reinvented. There are several models or patterns of governance in competition today, and actually the Middle East illustrates it very well. Among those 4 models, I would say the 2 have already failed, 1 will fail, and only the 4th one remains, and it's probably clear in the Middle East too. The external imposition, exportation of democracy by force has been tried in the Middle East, in Iraq and so on. It failed. It doesn't work. So democracy as a kind of obsession, as a kind of religion to impose to other countries or regions, notwithstanding the cultural patterns and so on, it doesn't work, and we know it. The other pattern of the kind, I would call it the revisionist pattern, which consists on getting rid of everything, the past, the models, politics, and so on. It's kind of nihilism in a way, this kind of Daesh style, doesn't work, and it failed too, and we know it too. The third pattern would be a return to authoritarianism, and the strong man, the strong leader, to put things back into order by force, is probably in the mood today. But it will fail.
Is this a new model of leadership that we are witnessing that is emerging?
No, but it's successful today.
Authoritarian?
There is a demand for that, but it will not work. It will fail. But we can see that work in Russia, in Turkey, in many places. Back to order pattern is something which is more or less in the air. It will fail. It will fail because it's already too late. The solution is not a kind of comeback to a return to the past order.
What you make of the Chinese model, for instance, that is still
the Chinese
not
model
only
is
surviving but expanding?
The Chinese model is more hybrid, I would say, because it's a mix of strong and central authority with an incredible profusion of initiatives. But the last model, which probably for the region and many others is the only one, is a new liberal democratic model. But for that, we need to invest on new forces, not the old, not old wine in new bottles. What are the new forces? We know them. It's new intellectuals, the young, and of course, women.
Those are the new leaders then.
No, but and we must identify, we must encourage, we must empower those actors, and it also needs to be a part of foreign policies. liberal democratic foreign policies must totally integrate that in their diplomacy. We must have a kind of new leadership diplomacy in different countries of the world, yes.
Mr. Mashar, let me bring that to you, that these democratic ideals did not succeed in the Arab world with the collapse of the Arab Spring, maybe with the exception of Tunisia. And now we're talking from after the collapse of the Arab Spring from the bottom, now there is a new Arab Spring from above. And it carries maybe not the ideas and the ideals of political participation, but of transparency and efficiency. What's your take on that? Can one replace the other? Can one model replace the other?
Let me first make a quick comment about democracy, because we are just too quick to declare the end of democracy because of a few challenges here and there. Yes, democracy is being challenged in the United States. Yes, liberal democracy is being challenged in Russia. It's been challenged in France and Germany, but it did not succeed. Let's remember that the world is not just the industrial world. In Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of Asia, democracy is actually thriving. And if you look at these countries 30 or 40 years ago, they were all dictatorships. And today, almost all of them are electoral democracies. So I would be a bit, hesitant to declare the end of democracy just because it faced few challenges. Let's remember, 123 countries out of 192 in the world today are democracies. Let's remember that out of the largest 25 economies in the world, 20 of them are in democratic countries. I mean, this is not a bad record. So I would now in the Arab world, we seem to insist on living in what I call a democracy-free zone, okay? Not in a zone of free democracy, but in a democracy-free zone. And that's not sustainable. I have hope, not from the governments, because again, with the exception of Tunisia, I don't think the governments have internalized the main lesson from 2011 and the Arab Spring. And that lesson is, if you want to keep your power from now on, you have to share it. You cannot keep absolute power without sharing it. And that lesson also is that the new generation is not going to accept to live by the rules of the old generation. I mean, if you talk to anybody here in the room, and I hope next year we will find some of the new generation here on the stage, not just in the audience, because they don't accept to live by our standards. And if we have failed in the Arab world to create democratic societies, I don't think they want to wait 30 or 40 more years before democracy comes. So to say that the Arab Spring has collapsed, I totally disagree with this notion. There is no transformational process in history that took 5 or 6 years, none. So why do you expect the Arab world to suddenly move from authoritarian regimes to democratic ones in 5 years? Why do you expect that when it has not happened anywhere else in the world? We are only seeing the first phase of a very long process that is going to be difficult, not linear, that will face many obstacles, that will face counter-revolutionary forces like we are seeing today. But in the end, the course of history is clear. People are demanding accountability, people are demanding a serious fight to corruption, and yes, people are demanding a better voice in decision-making. They have not been able to get it immediately in 5 years, but they will get it. And I think that's the main lesson the Arab governments need to understand, that they cannot run their countries the way they have done so for the last 30 or 40 years. And if they choose to do so, it will be at their own peril. Unfortunately, that is not being the case. There is another storm that I keep talking about. You know, we faced the first storm with the Arab Spring. There's another storm that is coming that no one wants to talk about, and it's the end of the oil era, and thank God it has ended. the end of the oil era in the Arab world, because oil has allowed the Arab world to finance an inefficient economic and political system through a patronage system that suppressed both political participation and productivity. And no wonder today in the world that the Arab world is among the, if not the least productive area in the whole world. But that has been made possible by oil. Now that oil is receding and that oil prices are going down, both for oil-producing countries and oil-importing countries, the Arab world today suddenly has to face reality, and that the way forward is to push for more productive economic systems and more inclusive political ones, because there is no other way. The status quo is simply not sustainable. What we are witnessing in the Arab world is this gray zone between the end of the status quo and not yet the beginning of another era. And in this gray zone, bad things happen, and they are happening, and they will continue to happen for a while. But once again, we are still witnessing the first phase of a very long process.
Mr. Fernandez. Let me take it from where Mr. Mashar stopped at this post-oil era, or the era of low oil prices. What's your view on the major challenges ahead and the way to deal with it?
Well, I mean, you know, the challenge is going to be that you somehow have to find economic and political models that give people at least some stake in terms of human dignity and political participation. You know, there's been a kind of Faustian bargain in the region. Both authoritarian regimes and the default political ideology out there, which is different types of political Islam, have had a vested interest in denigrating alternative forms of governance. So they, of course, both have talked about, you know, democracy. We don't, you know, democracy is a dirty word, right? Liberalism is a dirty word. Secularism is a dirty word. You know, al-Almaniya, that's not a word you want to use, right? Both regimes and Islamists have worked to do that, but the question is, where do you go? I agree with Marwan. Oil bought these regimes time to continue kind of these repressive models, these unproductive repressive models, but that's coming to the end, and they are not well positioned to transform themselves. They need to do so. As I said, some are trying. They're not trying that well, but at least they're trying, right?
But back to the US role. You have been part of an administration that at one point advocated or pushed a foreign policy program called Agenda for Democracy.
Yes.
And now, after 10 years, what's the drawn lessons from this experience?
Well, I think that wishing something doesn't make it so. I think the democracy agenda was absolutely the right agenda. But it's, number one, it's not something that the US can impose by force of arms. And number two, it's something that requires time. It's a long struggle. The authoritarian and liberal actors in the region have worked for decades. When we talk about the rise of political Islam in the Arab world, this didn't just happen bisadfi, you know? It was a fabricated movement. Money was spent, activism, education, all kinds of efforts were put into it. Well, the liberal, democratic, more humanistic, more dignity-promoting worldview, which a democracy agenda should represent, has to have long-term investment. We need to think like subversives, like revolutionaries, because that's what the bad guys are. They're revolutionaries. We've given up the democracy agenda too soon because we thought the Americans were going to push a button and they were going to make it happen, and that's not the way social, large, broad-based political movements happen. They happen over time, they happen with sacrifice, they happen with activists, with many skirmishes in a long battle. So that's, you need to invest in that to happen to succeed.
Mr. Brook, Back to the European leadership model. And there is a model that comes to my mind, Vladimir Putin, who is aggressive, proactive, and some say that Russia outsmarted Europe, namely, and even the United States in Syria. In a very short period of time, it could translate a military victory into a diplomatic one. I mean, what's your view on that? Is this the model to follow? Is this a triumphing model for the years to come?
Well, I think it happened in a period where under the presidency of Obama, America withdrew from the world stage in many ways. The reality is, if you follow the chronology of what Russia's done in the last few years, is that President Obama made a very clear statement which said that if Syria used chemical weapons, it was a red line that the US was not prepared to tolerate. And Syria used chemical weapons and the US didn't do anything. And therefore you can then follow the line of, first of all, Putin went into Crimea and the world did nothing. Putin then has created a hybrid warfare in East Ukraine. And to bring that back to the European model is that there was a big argument in the EU about the sanctions that should be put on Russia. It was only the then Prime Minister David Cameron who forced the issue of putting heavy sanctions on Russia. And I don't think it's without coincidence that the second chemical attack in Syria happened after the inauguration of Donald Trump. But the fact that a number of missiles were launched against military targets in Syria has in many ways not seen Russia advance in the way that perhaps it was at that point, and indeed the balance appears to be turning in Syria, certainly against Daesh. The problem comes in the different philosophies. So an autocratic president in Russia is always going to be popular because the DNA of the Russian people is that they must protect Mother Russia. If you look through the last 1,000 years of history, to the time of Alexander the Great, that the idea that the borders of Mother Russia will be invaded from the outside, and you bring that right up to the Second World War, when the Nazis got to the gates of Moscow, that idea that Russia is always under threat from outside forces, to have a strong autocratic leader in Russia plays very well with their electorate and plays very well into their model of thinking and how or who they need to be leading Russia. Now that's not the model in the West, but of course you then have to throw into mix natural resources and gas especially. And the recalcitrance of the EU to not go as hard on the Russians as perhaps we eventually did was due to a very simple fact that 25% of Western Europe's gas comes from Russia, 30% of Germany's gas comes from Russia, and these things were always taken into consideration. So, where are we today? Well, you've got a president in America who, although says it's about America first and looks more insular, has actually been more present on the world stage than President Obama was. You've got a situation in Europe where the European politicians are going to have to start looking at the general election results in their countries. The idea of pushing on a federalist agenda and ignoring the will at some point in the next 12 months is going to have to be recognised that that is not going to work anymore. The rise of the far right in Germany, in France, in Holland, are a direct consequence, I believe, of that removal of power and centralisation of it, and they want it back in their countries. And so when you look at that whole mix of who has the influence in the world, it in many ways brings it back to the nation state, but the argument of counterbalances. There needs to be counterbalances, and the progression of Russia, especially in Syria and in Ukraine, is, in my opinion, a lack of counterbalances at the time that happened. but I think it's noticeable that that has not, in 2017, has not advanced in the way that it did in 2016.
Mr. Charion, I mean, how sustainable is this rise of nationalism in Europe? It were a period or an era where Europe was offering a universal dream. It was the case in the 19th century and part of the 20th century. But now we're like in a phase of a disenchanted Europe, and what we're seeing are, I mean, not dreams, but this rise of nationalism, or let's put it, very narrow dreams.
First, I'm not sure if it's a rise of nationalism or a return of identity. I'm not sure exactly what it is, because I think that, yes, there is a disillusion, there is a disappointment.
And or the rise of the extreme right. I mean, we're not
Precisely. I think it's a return of identity. When you read the discourse of the extreme right, it's not only the nation state. It's, for instance, the Christian roots of Europe, in France, the Christian roots of France, and so on. It's a real return to identity. But I think the most key element is probably disappointment with the EU. For a reason that has been witnessed and seen in other places in the world, including in the Middle East, the societies cannot be taken for granted. I'm pro-European. I'm not Eurosceptical. Or also, on the contrary, I strongly believe in the European model and the European actor and so on. But I think that the societies have been taken for granted. And you cannot do that all the time. This is one element, because we were so sure that everybody would agree or follow. No, the time is not for that anymore. People are empowered, there are skillful individuals, people, they read the press, they read the news. It's not the time of fathers of Europe anymore, when you had authority who could give the guidelines and everybody could follow. No, it's not the case anymore. So the populations cannot be taken for granted. And also, I think that most European leaders played too much with Europe, with a kind of double discourse. One consisting of being a kind of engine in Europe and proposing new policies and so on. But on the other hand, most leaders in Europe wanted to be seen as the protector of the country against Brussels. And you cannot do that forever. You cannot come back from Brussels every week and tell your own country, look, I saved you once again from Brussels, and then ask them to vote for the European Constitution and so on. And what happened in the UK what was not a surprise to me, I must say, and I'm not the only one, because I'm a reader of The Economist, for instance, and I've lived in the UK for a long time, and I read the press and so on. Well, for 20, 30 years, I've been reading things in the British press that are not very favorable to the EU. I mean, the national sport was to the kind of EU bashing. And when, after that, you ask people, finally, to vote in favor of Europe, it doesn't work. And we had exactly the same in France. But this kind of double discourse is true everywhere. You cannot take the people for granted. You cannot have a discourse to legitimate your action and then ask people to vote in a different way or to behave a different way just because you ask them.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with every statement there, and it's, I think the truest statement there was how the political leaders of the West, as you say, on the one hand say we must be in Europe, on the other hand use it to bash. And actually, if you look at what happened, so in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty came out, if there had been a referendum, probably 70% of the United Kingdom would have said yes and voted for it. You then went through a period of governments saying, no, you can't have your say. And then you got to Tony Blair. And what Tony Blair was really good at was interfering into people's lives and changing things and always saying it was the fault of Brussels. When 9 times out of 10 it had nothing to do with Brussels. It was the agenda of his government, but he blamed Brussels. And this is the point which comes. Now, everything I've said about Europe, I say as somebody who actually voted to remain in the EU. But it's the analysis I've made that the model is broken. The model is broken. When you look at the election results happening across Britain in terms of the referendum, in France, in Germany, in Holland, and Denmark, when you look at the founding nations of the EU, those people are the ones who are saying this model isn't working. And fundamentally is because it's been a very convenient excuse for governments to interfere into people's lives and take away some of their freedoms and restrict what they do and blame somebody else. And as you say, it's no surprise. It wasn't so much led by the media in Britain as the media reacting to and expanding on what the leaders were doing themselves. I think they felt that the model was impenetrable, so we can blame it over there. It doesn't matter, it'll always be there. It's a good scapegoat.
Your Excellency, back to the Arab world, and when we talk about leadership, we talk about vision, and we talk about priorities. If you are to list the top priorities ahead, the one we have to focus on, what would you say?
I will give three. In the political arena, there has to be more inclusive systems, and that means electoral bodies that are representative and that gradually, I'm not talking immediately, but gradually result in a change in the power structure of each country, so that the executive is no longer dominant, and so that the legislative branches and the judicial branches really can apply a system of checks and balances and provide people with the sense that they are being participatory in the decision-making process. Because right now, if you talk to anybody, particularly among the new generation of the Arab world, the level of the trust gap between the new generation and between government is huge. In the economic sense, you have to move to a more productive system. The rentier system of the Arab world is over because of oil. Moving to a more productive system, meaning empowering the private sector to be able to provide jobs and become the job provider instead of government, while government becomes the regulatory body for economic activity, is a must and must be done gradually. It cannot be done without changing your educational system, because the educational system in the Arab world is a system that is based on rote learning, has no critical thinking, has no ability to provide people with the ability to question what they are being taught. It's a system where truths are absolute and not relative. It's a system where tolerance of other points of views and other civilizations is almost non-existent. And so all of that needs to change. And on the societal level, we need a new social contract in each Arab country, but not a social contract that is given to them by this government and then they are asked to implement it. A social contract that is negotiated among the different components of society itself, much like what they have done in Tunisia. A social contract that assures all components of society that their rights are going to be respected, that no party is going to come to government and then deny them their way of life or their right to participate politically. These are three fundamental pillars in the Arab world. They are not going to be achieved overnight, okay? I'm not a naive person to think that democracy is going to spring overnight. This is going to take hard work. This is going to take lobbying by people who care about their countries and who are willing to fight for, peacefully, of course, to fight for their governments to change. This is going to take a generation or two. There are no shortcuts to democracy. But if we just sit there and think, that the passage of time alone is going to result in a better Arab world, we are, far mistaken. Is this lesson being internalized? Unfortunately, not so far. Will it be internalized? Inshallah. Maybe the end of the oil era will push and the bad economic situation, and I think the economic situation in the Arab world is going to get even worse in the coming years. And unemployment is going to rise even more. Unemployment in Saudi Arabia, you might know, is 33% among the youth. 33% in an oil-producing country. This is a time bomb. And so, maybe the economic situation is going to push governments to do the right thing. I don't know. What I do know is that this is going to be a very difficult process in the years
The
ahead.
same question for Mr. Fernandez, but from the viewpoint of someone sitting outside. What are the priorities? But very short because we're running out of time.
Well, I
The
think
time is over, and you will take 10 minutes Q&A.
I think my concern about when you look at the region is that many people look at the region and they think this is the past. But my fear is that the region we see today is actually not the future just of the region, but of much of the world. What I mean is the extreme inequality in the region, the economic dysfunction, the massive unemployment. I mean, there are some scholars who say that this is actually the future of the West. And I worry about, can our tortuously arrived at liberal democratic system survive 40% unemployment in the West? Permanent 40% unemployment in the West, extreme inequality in the West. My fear is that we are going to become, these challenges of globalization and automation that we're facing are going to lead to models which are basically going to put the liberal democratic model in under such tremendous pressure that we're going to wind up looking more like the Middle East of today rather than the Middle East looking like the West of today.
Okay, it's open. Thank you. Thank you, Gente. We are open for the Q&A. We open the floor, yes?
This morning. I was intrigued. His Excellency has left us, but I was intrigued by his opening remark that an industrial revolution, if you will, is embarking. And before there was an industrial revolution, Mr. Hernandez and Sir, there was an enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, if you will. There was an age of reason. And speaking as an economist, I lived through the 1980s. 1987 in particular was an age of changing the governing principles between rational expectations and the following rules of monetary policy. My question, and if we're gonna look forward, and I would really appreciate some sort of binary thinking. Are we embarking on an age of reason? Can you build on some sort of rational expectations for the future? Would the new enlightenment be coming from that, beyond the Atlantic this time, rather than David Hume and Adam Smith? So what sort of forecast can you provide for us? And let's not talk about an industrial revolution based on technology and social media and so forth. What we really aim for is what governing principles can be hoped for, in the next coming age of reason or non-reason.
Let us make the question as quick, as short as possible. And let me remind you that we have translators, so feel free in asking in all the language, in Arabic or in French, just in case. Because we have the translators, yes, this is... anyone who will...
I would simply say to that the model as we move forward into this part should be the age of listening. Governments are there to serve their electorate, not just lead their electorate. You need to lead an agenda through listening to the demands of the people. And that probably in Britain has happened in two distinct periods. It happened in the Labour government of 1945 to 1950 with the creation of the welfare state, and it happened in the Thatcher government of the 1980s, where there were huge reforms needed in both of those areas as a direct result to listening to the public. And if today we feel that the models aren't working, and we're seeing some election results to predict that, then actually what we need to be in now is, yes, the age of reasoning, but actually it should be the age of listening and leading through what you've listened to.
If I could just add one point, I think
Yes,
there's a real danger when you talk about, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, you mentioned the changes in age of reason, and that is, a wise man once said, man does not live by bread alone. And we've thought that the Homo economicus model was going to be the engine that was going to kind of drive this new age of reason and all of that. And I think that's looking at increasingly as a very rickety model if you're looking in the next 20 years or so. I think we face a real challenge on the whole question of governments that can provide identity, meaning, dignity for people looking forward, especially in the West. I think that's something that we've ignored far too long.
Just one word to
Yes,
the
Mr.
question.
I-
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
It was long,
no,
but
please.
it.
I do
it's still
think
the
we are
debate.
at the dawn of the age of reason in the Arab world. And I say that because one very positive development that came out of the Arab Spring is the loss of fear. The fear barrier has been broken. And people today feel freer to debate issues that were considered taboo, whether they are on religious reform, whether they are on political reform or economic reform. People are freer to talk about these issues. It doesn't mean they're going to solve them anytime soon, and it doesn't mean that this is going to be a smooth or even peaceful process. But the start of talking frankly about our problems, I think, has begun.
Yeah, I
Frederick?
also think we're heading towards an era of rationality and age of reason, because even I don't believe in mindless crowds or irrational crowds. I think even in the most tragic thing that happened recently, there is a rationality, even in the rise of Daesh, in a way, because it was a kind of reaction towards a certain kind of system that made some population accept the rise of Daesh, not for the good result, as everybody knows. But I mean, in the crisis, in the wars, there is no irrationality. There are answers from population to certain types of situations. It's certainly not always the good answers. But if you consider from Brexit to many things that happen in many reasons, there is a rationality behind. There are populations very well aware of the situations, who try with their own means to give an answer, a response to a certain type, a rational answer to the situations. And so if we want to avoid the worst and the most extreme answers to the situations, we must, as we said earlier, empower the new actors. We must empower the young intellectuals, women, and so on. But this is rational, and I deeply think we are not heading towards total irrationality. I don't think so.
So Emmanuel Kant can still be happy.
Thank you. After the few years of the Arab Spring, we have a lot of problems. One of those problems is the extremism. Is that a result of the Arab Spring circumstances? What we are doing exactly to analyze the consequences of the Arab Spring? Is there a really deep study of this movement? And what are the lessons learned from the Arab Springs? How we can push for democracy if we don't have a very deep study and the results in our hand for what happened until now from the beginning of the Arab Spring? Thank you.
Okay. Anyone, gentlemen? Micro, please, Honik.
There are two schools of thought in the Arab world today about what has happened in 2011. One school of thought says that the cause of all the instability and chaos and wars that we are witnessing today is the revolutions of 2011. And the counter forces today are trying to take the Arab world back to the pre-2011 period. There's a second school of thought, which I belong to, which says that the Arab Spring happened because of the explicit and clear lack of democracy and presence of authoritarianism in the Arab world that has led people to the street. The Arab world lived by social contracts before 2011, which basically said the government will provide basic health, education, jobs and subsidies for citizens in return for citizens not demanding a voice in political affairs. When the government provided these services adequately, people were, not happy, but they accepted their fate. Starting from the last decade, governments started saying, we don't have enough resources to give you health, education, jobs, or subsidies. Therefore, the quality of these services have gone down, but we are still insisting that you respect the other pillar, which is keep your mouth shut. It doesn't work this way. And that is what led to the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. So from now on, if you're asking what is the lesson of the Arab Spring, the lesson of the Arab Spring is, to me, more inclusive political systems and more productive economic systems. If you are not able to satisfy people economically and politically, you're in big trouble. There are countries in the Middle East where they were able to satisfy people economically, for example, in the Emirates, and therefore they could afford little political participation. There are countries in the Middle East where I don't know if there are countries in the Middle East where the political participation is bad, but one formula is not sustainable and is clear to me, and that formula is no economic space or progress and no political progress at the same time. That's a very dangerous form.
Frederick, very shortly, because I have still have two questions.
I think it's your question and your answer are very important, because it's very important to make the right analysis of what happened with the Arab Springs and why it did not lead to what was expected. And I think there is a wrong analysis in many European countries and Western countries at the moment, which consists of saying that it's over, it failed, and I think it did not. I mean, it's just a step, but the demands are still there. As Excellency just said, the demand for dignity, the demand for a better economic situation, the demand for better social situation is still there. And the Arab Spring, whether the 2011 step was just one step. But if we deny that, if we think that the answer is that after all, some countries were not stable and we have to turn to other countries which were more stable and find for the right strong leader, I think it's a wrong answer. The right answer is that it was a revenge of societies, and it will go on.
Thank you. I'll take both questions into one package, then a final round. بعد في حدا عنده أسئلة بعد؟ لا. Yes, تفضل.
We are talking about leadership models, and what I see is that in the Western countries, we see leaders winning on economical basis and on economical issues, while in the Arab countries we are talking more political issues. So why there is this difference?
This gap.
Why we don't have this gap? Yes, why this gap is so huge? You talk about it a little bit, Mr. Mashar. Also, I need more details about this point, please. Why we cannot go to economical issues where the people are hurt by small things, you know, like in Lebanon, no water, no electricity, and you know all the
Why
details.
economic issues are not sexy?
Yes. Yes.
My question is about the youth, and when we saw the revolution in Egypt, it was from a dream to a nightmare, and they went back to where they were before. And Dr. Maasha, you tackled the issue where the youth are the ones who are going to do the revolution and to make the change. And changes come with education. They're not educated enough. Do you think the youth will be able to create governments that are modern with their lack of education? Do you trust them?
So the final round, gentlemen.
I mean, I fundamentally think that it comes down to freedom and how you define that freedom, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in the West. So in the West, you talk about economics, but economics create people's freedom. And if the economics is failing for them, they don't have the freedom to do what they want to do. And if you look in the Middle East, they don't have the freedom to challenge their governments or freedom to worship in the way they want to worship. So I don't think it's a difference in the systems. I think it can all be summarized as freedom. And whether you're in an established democracy or whether you're in a dictatorship or whether you're in an autocracy, you need to be working constantly towards how can people be free to live their lives responsibly. And that, I think, is the driving principle that drives most human beings.
Frederic?
No,
it's okay.
To the first question, I think the sexiness of the economic issues is coming. The 20th century has been the century of ideology in the Arab world. First pan-Arab ideology, then Islamic ideology. Both have failed because both have not direct